Good afternoon. I'm David Van Slyke, and I have the privilege to serve as the Dean of the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs. Welcome to today's State of Democracy event with Mr. Michael Atkinson. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge with respect the Onondaga Nation, the firekeepers of the Haudenosaunee, the indigenous people on whose ancestral lands Syracuse University now stands. I would like to thank Norman and Marcia Lee Berkman for their generous support of the State of Democracy lecture series and their enduring enthusiasm of the Maxwell School. I would also like to thank Grant Rear and Kelly Coleman from the Campbell Public Affairs Institute, Tom Fazio from the Maxwell ICT unit, my assistant, Ms. Bethany Wallawender, and my graduate assistant, Ms. Julia Devon. Let me begin with a very brief introduction of our guest, Maxwell alum, Mr. Michael K. Atkinson. Mr. Atkinson received a BA in political science from Syracuse University. And after graduating from law school at Cornell, he joined the law firm of Winston & Strawn, where he worked for 11 years, first as an associate and then as a partner. After the September 11th attacks, Mr. Atkinson went to work in the U.S. Department of Justice for 15 years. First as a trial attorney in the Justice Department's criminal division, focused in the fraud section, and then as an assistant U.S. attorney in the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Columbia. In May of 2018, Mr. Atkinson became the presidentially appointed and Senate-confirmed Inspector General of the intelligence community. Now, for all of our audience members, there is a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We'll speak with Mr. Atkinson first, and then have time for a broader set of audience questions. So let's begin. Mr. Atkinson, welcome back virtually to the Maxwell School, and thank you so very much for joining us today and for your service to our nation. We're looking forward to an engaging conversation with you.
Thank you, Dave. Happy to be here.
I'd like to start with a bit of a softball question for you. For those less familiar with Inspector Generals, I'd like to ask you if you would briefly talk about the role of Inspector Generals in the government, and more specifically, what you view as some of the challenges for public servants working in the intelligence community that might not be the same for others working in public service.
Sure. So the fundamental mission of an Inspector General is to root out waste, fraud, and abuse in our government programs. There are today 74 inspectors general throughout the federal government. One of the things that appealed to me about being an inspector general was that inspectors general by law are supposed to be nonpartisan and apolitical. That appealed to me because I had served under both Democratic and Republican administrations as a federal prosecutor. Another requirement, and this gets to one of the challenges of being inspector general, is that by law, they're also supposed to be, required to be, in fact, independent of the agency or department that they oversee. So when I was the Inspector General of the Intelligence Community, I was part of the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, and I reported to the Director of National Intelligence. But by law, I was supposed to be independent of that agency, because I also had a dual reporting obligation, like other inspectors general, to the Congress, and specifically to the two Congressional Intelligence Oversight Committees, the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence and the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. So that's the mission. And then in terms of being an IG in the intelligence community, the complications come from, one of the complications anyways, comes from the fact that there is a lot of secrecy in our intelligence community, and that's necessary. One of the reasons the United States intelligence community is so effective is because it's secret. But as we know from our history, secrecy is not necessarily an American value. In fact, when our country was founded, the founding generation viewed secrecy as part of the old world tyranny, and what they wanted was transparency and public accountability, and that's hard in the intelligence community because of the need for secrecy. And for an inspector general as well, you have to root out waste, fraud, and abuse, and you have to be able to report that to the intelligence communities, but you have to do it in a way that doesn't jeopardize or compromise the sources and methods of collecting intelligence. That is that gives our country, an edge over adversaries when it comes to protecting our national security.
Great, Michael. That's a great overview and a great way to begin. At your confirmation hearing for Inspector General of the intelligence community, you pledged to establish a safe program where whistleblowers would not have fear of retaliation and where they could be confident that the system would treat them fairly and impartially. From your perspective, how can we institutionalize the role of whistleblowers within our democracy without compromising those security interests?
Well, it seems like years ago when I made that statement, but it was only about 2 years ago. I think that has been institutionalized in our country, and I think it's been institutionalized in our laws. I think what the Ukraine whistleblower situation sort of brought to the surface is how important it is that we don't politicize those institutions. When you think about the intelligence community and secrecy, the fact of the matter is that very few Americans will ever have access to the secret programs and activities that make the intelligence community so effective. And so because there's so few Americans with authorized access to those programs and activities, that means there's few people in a position to raise an alarm when they see wrongdoing. Then it raises the age-old question of, who watches the watchers? And one group of people that watches the watchers in the intelligence community are whistleblowers. And our country has a very long history of protecting and empowering whistleblowers. It goes back to the Continental Congress over 240 years ago, where the first whistleblower law was passed, and the Continental Congress made it clear that all employees in the federal government have a duty to report wrongdoing. And that continues to exist today. In fact, since the 1970s, those laws have been strengthened and empowered at the same time that the laws have strengthened and empowers inspectors general. And IGs are another group that watches the watchers in the intelligence community. And so those laws, since 2000 especially, have all been nonpartisan. If you look at the whistleblower laws that have passed since 2000, and there have been over 20 of them, all of them passed unanimously. So you have laws in the books, you have people in place as whistleblowers who know it's their ethical duty to report wrongdoing. You have inspectors general who by law are required to be independent and provide objective oversight and help those whistleblowers bring their concerns to light. And you have a nonpartisan tradition of both protecting whistleblowers and having independent inspectors general. Those institutions are there, they're on the books, they've been strengthened. They probably could be strengthened further, but what's important is that they not be politicized.
So Michael, maybe you could take us a bit more. Where is that line between security and whistleblowers in order to not politicize it?
That's a good question. And the line is the difference between an authorized disclosure and a leak. And so an authorized disclosure is a whistleblower, like the Ukraine whistleblower, for example, who used the authorized process to bring their concerns about alleged wrongdoing to the attention of Inspector General, and then ultimately to the attention of the Congressional Intelligence Committees. Like, that is a secure way to allege wrongdoing without harming national security. And if we don't have those whistleblower laws, or we don't protect whistleblowers, then we run the risk that an individual intelligence community who sees wrongdoing will make a different choice, potentially a much more dangerous choice. And that would be to leak the information, to take the law into his or her own hand and to leak that information to the media or to some other person who's not authorized to have that information. And that's how real harm to national security can happen.
From your perspective, when you were talking about, in the statements that you said you made, which felt like a long time ago and were only 2 years ago, how much were the WikiLeaks and the Snowden affair in the back of your mind about the type of culture change and structural changes that you hope to enact as the new IG in the intelligence community?
I will say that they were at the front of my mind. And they are at the front of my mind because most of the people who I talked to during the confirmation process wanted it to be a priority to strengthen whistleblowers and the whistleblower protection laws. So, for example, when I was preparing for my Senate confirmation hearing, I went and met individually with many of the members on the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. And all of those members that I met with individually asked me, there were two general themes. One was, will you protect whistleblowers? And two, will you be independent and impartial? Because those go hand in hand. The whistleblowers need to know that they have a trusted source of providing their allegations of wrongdoing rather than leaking. And those laws will not work if people don't have trust in both the process and the people who are enforcing the laws. And so those senators, both in my individual meetings, and as you were the statement I made during my confirmation hearing was either during my opening statement or in response to a question, one of many questions I got at my confirmation hearing about my commitment to whistleblowers. And so it was at the forefront of my mind because the folks, 2 years ago had a real good sense of the harm that can happen when folks leak information rather than going through the authorized process. For whatever reason, someone goes outside the authorized channel and decides to leak. Well, for whatever reason, the fact is harm to national security can and does occur.
Michael, when you were nominated by President Trump for the position of Inspector General in May of 2018, it was then in September of 2019 that you alerted Congress to a whistleblower complaint about the president. That eventually led to his impeachment, and on April 3rd of this year, you were then dismissed by President Trump, who said he no longer had confidence in you in this role. What does this teach us about how the laws designed to protect the independence of inspector generals actually hold up?
I think it demonstrates how difficult it is for any public servant to be independent, required to be independent by law. At the same time, they can be treated as any other political appointee and be dismissed at the pleasure of the president. That seems to be where we've landed. I'm not sure that was Congress's intent in terms of requiring inspectors general to be independent, but I think that's the reality of where we are today. And I think that asks a lot of someone who is in the role of an inspector general to be independent, to act objectively in an administration today that that's not necessarily what the folks in charge are looking for in a political appointee. And so it's just extraordinarily challenging for inspectors general to provide that independent oversight if they can be dismissed for any reason, including doing what the law expects them to do.
Michael, your point really raises what we see in some other parts of the government, and you opened your statement by noting that you had worked for Democratic administrations and Republican administrations, and that your own sense was, how do I be both impartial and bipartisan? Some types of organizations, especially the Government Accountability Office, the Comptroller General is appointed to a tenure for which no one particular administration, even if reelected, could summarily dismiss. Now, the Comptroller General works for the Congress. That's who the Government Accountability Office has as its main client, if you will. But in your dismissal, did you find other IGs reaching out and saying, we have to find other mechanisms to be able to ensure both our structural stability, but also our ability to execute the very mission of being an IG?
I think it's a real challenge to be both independent and be treated like any other political appointee. And I think that I did have communications with other inspectors general after I was dismissed about how they were going to try to navigate those challenges. And I've had talks as well with folks on the Hill about ways to improve the laws so that inspectors general can be independent at the same time. We can make sure that the president has all of the executive authority he needs as the head of the executive branch, and that's there's a lot of tension there. And as you were mentioning at the beginning, as someone who's trained as an attorney, the importance of separation of powers is it's not lost on me, and I certainly understand that the president, as the head of the executive branch, needs to have control over the people in the executive branch. The tension is that Congress has set up this group of people, inspectors general, who by law are supposed to be independent. And there had been generally an understanding that inspectors general would not be removed unless there was some cause for their removal. That they would not be, but under no circumstance, I think there was a general understanding, would they be removed if they did what they were by the rule of law, they were supposed to do, which was act independently and objectively. And so I think we've landed in a place where we're expecting people to do one thing, but at the same time, they can be removed if they do precisely that.
Maybe I could drill down just a little bit more. In some parts of the government, especially where there have been concerns about fraud, waste, and abuse, I'm thinking of, for example, the appointment of a special investigator, the special investigator for Afghan reconstruction, for example. The effort to really create more independence around that special inspector general so that they would have more purview and authority. From your perspective, is anytime something becomes special and everyone becomes special, there's not so much that's special any longer. But do you see elements around this role that could be restructured and institutionalized?
I do see. The Supreme Court had a case earlier this year about an executive branch authority where, there would have to be either term limits or some other provisions in place, like a special counsel, for that position in the executive branch to be constitutional if there was something beyond the pleasure of the president that would have to trigger the person's removal. But what I'll say is that the system today for inspectors general works pretty well with them as members of the executive branch, because here's the critical thing. Inspectors general have direct access to all of the information in the department or agency that they oversee. And that's especially important in the intelligence community. So, for example, my authority as the Inspector General of the intelligence community was coextensive with the authority of the Director of National Intelligence. So whatever program, intelligence activity that he could look at, I could look at as well. Now, there was a statutory provision where he could prevent me from looking at a specific program or activity, but he would have to alert Congress to that. So there'd be, again, public accountability and oversight. But that direct access is critical. And one of the things that the Government Accountability Office, for example, as a part of the legislative branch, they don't have direct access to all of those records, and nor should they necessarily, because they're not in the executive branch. So the IGs need that direct access in order to be able to make sure that what they're being told is the truth, that they can get to ground truth and validate it. And so it'd be very hard to get that access if you weren't part of the executive branch. On the other hand, it's also very hard to get around the president's constitutional authority to remove those subordinate officers for anything more than just the pleasure of the president.
So why do you think the complaint was filed with the Office of the Inspector General of the Intelligence Community? And did you initially think, this should be filed somewhere else? So we talked about who watches the watchers. Whistleblowers watch the watchers. Inspectors general watch the watchers. And the other significant group that watches the watchers is Congress, the Congressional Oversight Committees. So Congress passed a law in 1998 called the Intelligence Community Whistleblower Protection Act that authorizes individuals in the intelligence community to file reports that involve classified information with inspectors general if those individuals want that information to go to Congress, to the people's house. And so that law authorized the Ukraine whistleblower to file that complaint because it involved classified information at the time
with an inspector general of the intelligence community. I was one of those inspectors general that was authorized by law to receive that complaint. And so by law, that complaint came to me. And my job was to determine whether that complaint was urgent, was a matter of urgent concern, and there's specific statutory criteria that determine that. And then also determine whether it was credible, whether it appeared credible. Not necessarily that it was in fact credible or that it was, beyond a reasonable doubt, believable, but just that it appeared credible. And then in terms of your second question, we had, by law, we had 14 calendar days to review that complaint and determine whether it was urgent and credible. As it happened, I was the first person in the office to read that complaint. And I remember sitting at my desk, and it's a 7-page letter. And the first 6 sentences lay out these extraordinary allegations about the president allegedly soliciting foreign election interference in the 2020 U.S. presidential election. And then it also alleges in those first 6 sentences that this alleged conduct involves both Rudy Giuliani, the president's personal attorney, and the attorney general. And so I saw that, and in the first minute, I realized how extraordinary it was. And like any reasonable public servant, my first thought was, who can I give this to? But I quickly also realized that there was no one else I could give it to. And so for the time being, I was going to have to confront the complaint, and that's what I did.
When you transmitted it to Mr. McGuire and identified it as both urgent and credible, and he did not further transmit it, I wonder if you can take us just a little bit behind the scenes in your mind and the emotions that you were feeling about how do you now adjudicate that issue yourself? Because as you said, you were thinking about both executive authority and constitutional powers and processes and how to, remediate those issues.
So after the 14 days, when we determined that it was urgent and credible, we transmitted the whistleblower's complaint and my determination that it was urgent and credible to the Director of National Intelligence. Now, at that time, the Director of National Intelligence had been in that job for about a week. So Joe McGuire was the Director of National Intelligence, and he had just taken over for the former Director of National Intelligence, Dan Coates. And we all, I think, understood that we were, because the conduct involved the president, the alleged conduct involved the president, that we were, it was an extraordinary situation because the president is not a member of the intelligence community. So there was a very good collaborative relationship between the Office of Director of National Intelligence and my office for the week period, the 1 week period when the DNI was, by law, was we thought was supposed to transmit the disclosure to the intelligence committees. Near the end of that week, toward the end of that week, when the DNI's 7-day time was starting to run up, we got word that the Department of Justice had gotten involved. And so by the end of that 7-day period, when the DNI was supposed to transmit the disclosure to the intelligence communities, we learned that the Director of National Intelligence was going to follow the advice of the Department of Justice not to transmit the disclosure or my determination to the intelligence committees. It was at that point that I continued to engage with the attorneys at ODNI to I knew why they were doing what they were doing, but I was trying to talk to them about the reasons why I felt the disclosure still, the law required the disclosure to go to the intelligence committees. And there was about a 2-week period when about a 1 week period when I had engaged in multiple conversations with the folks, the lawyers from the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, about what I felt was the need to disclose the materials to Congress, because I thought that's what the law required. I also had a whistleblower who had classified information about alleged wrongdoing, who had no other authorized way to transmit that information to Congress. And so I felt like the whistleblower was stuck in a place where he or she couldn't do what they thought the law required. And I was in a position where I felt like I was required to notify the intelligence committees as well. So after a week, I did write a letter to the intelligence committees to alert them to the fact of a disclosure. Now, I couldn't tell them anything about the substance of the whistleblower's disclosure because of concerns over, potentially waiving executive privilege or potentially, disclosing classified information. And so I didn't want to make an unauthorized disclosure. So I alerted the committees to the fact of a whistleblower disclosure without just revealing any of the content or any, sensitive information. And then that triggered a series of events that eventually, broke loose the whistleblower complaint and also ultimately the transcript of the phone call between the president and his Ukrainian counterpart.
I know, Michael, I'm sure there are many questions coming into the Q&A chat box that will want to take this up, but I want to transition just a little bit to an issue that I'd like to get your perspective on, because I think it goes to a larger issue in the intelligence community. Let me frame it like this. In light of, social movements that are focused on systemic and structural racism, I'd like you to help us understand your reflections on the role that diversity plays within the intelligence community. And what I mean by that is, what do you think are some of the main hurdles for more diversity in the community, and how to systematically make our intelligence institutions more diverse? Because as I've thought and listened to some of the things that you've pointed to, it really does suggest that, there's kind of, I don't want to overgeneralize this, but perhaps a monolithic approach within the intelligence community that lacks greater diversity. And how might we address that? Might that be one avenue to remediating some of these issues around disclosure, whistleblower protections, and thinking about the security offset against other executive authorities?
Well, let me say this about that. Diversity was one of the core values of my office. So integrity, commitment, transparency, and diversity. They're core values of the Office of the Inspector General of the Intelligence Community. And diversity is also one of the core values for the larger, certainly for the Office of Director of National Intelligence and for the larger intelligence community. And there's, when you look at the surveys for the employees in the intelligence community is rated, one of the best places to work in the federal government. So I think in many ways, particularly when it comes to equal opportunity and diversity training, at least the way they used to do diversity training until a couple months ago, I think it was a very good place for folks to work, for public servants who wanted to, work for the right reasons, who were intrinsically motivated and wanted to be, a public servant. It was a very tolerant and sensitive place. That was always my experience in terms of that aspect of diversity. Where I think the intelligence community could always, use some improvement is in diversity of thought. And I think what, if you think about it's a secret insular environment, and necessarily so because of the powerful programs and activities that it has to keep secret. But that secret insular culture can sometimes lead to groupthink, and that's the danger, is that you don't have the diversity of thought. And so what the intelligence community needs to be mindful of is that diversity of thought, and recognizing that those who offer constructive dissent play a very important role in our in public service and in public accountability. And that's what whistleblowers do. That's the rule of a whistleblower, is to offer constructive dissent, that diversity of thought. And the advantage of that diversity of thought and open-mindedness is that whether we agree with the dissenter, the whistleblower, or not, whether we agree with that person or not, whether they're right or wrong, if we listen to them and hear them out, it might not change our decision, but it will likely improve the quality of our decision-making process. And that's what whistleblowers really do, is offer that constructive dissent, so that even if we don't agree with them, they make our decision-making process better, which ultimately should lead to better decisions. And that's a real tension in the intelligence community, because you have a tension between your speaking up, speaking truth to power, doing the right thing, and on the other side, this sense of group loyalty, being loyal to either your intelligence community element or your individual office. And that's a big problem. Not problem. It's a especially significant challenge when it comes to the military components in the intelligence community, because of the necessary need for obedience to authority and a camaraderie. And so you have this tension between, you have an ethical duty as a government employee to speak up, and on the other side you've got group loyalty. And so how do you make that work? And one way you make it work is you encourage people to offer constructive dissent, and you offer them authorized ways to give that constructive dissent. And for whistleblowers, you also can offer them confidentiality and anonymity to raise their concerns. And that's, again, where inspectors general have a significant role to play, because if you're in a group and you want to speak up, but you don't want to be seen as doing something to hurt the group, you can make an anonymous complaint to an inspector general. You can make a confidential complaint to an inspector general, and your constructive dissent, may make a significant difference in correcting what could be a very serious problem.
Wonderful answer. Thank you so much for that. I wouldn't be doing my job as the Dean of the Maxwell School if I were not to ask you, in our few minutes left before we go to Q&A, some questions about your career and advice you might have for Syracuse students. So if you'll permit me, let me frame it a little bit like this. After the September 11th attacks, you decide to leave the law firm where you're working and obviously having a lot of success to enter government. And that was a pivotal time in America. A lot of young people see today as quite a pivotal time, and I don't disagree with that. So I have a couple of questions I'd like to just ask you first. And first is, when you think about your experiences here, how did the Maxwell School and your experience and connections at Syracuse University help direct you to public service and give you the kind of moral ballast you needed while serving, especially after the last couple of years?
I think what Syracuse did, and especially the Maxwell School, was, validate my interest in government, in studying government, and then also studying the different governments around the world, the different structures, and the legal frameworks that were underneath all of those governments. And so I really enjoyed my political science classes and learning about the different government structures and learning about our government, especially in terms of the separation of powers. I still remember my constitutional law class at Syracuse. And so it validated my interest in government and my interest in the law, and in a very positive way, because if it weren't for Syracuse, I'm not sure I'd have gone to law school, because I really enjoyed my professors and got a lot out of political science, which put me on a path to law, which I thought I wanted to do. But, the passion that my professors in college had for that subject matter rubbed off. And so put me on a path to law school, went to law school. But then, just after 10 years, and with the attacks of September 11th, just felt like I wanted different responsibilities, different challenges, and different rewards. And, intrinsic rewards, especially. And that's what, led me into public service. 18 years ago, and I loved it. I love public service. I loved everything about it. I never felt like I got in any kind of a comfort zone, in part because I kept taking myself out of comfort zones, taking on bigger cases, taking on management responsibilities, supervisory responsibilities, mentoring responsibilities, but all the while, having the intrinsic rewards that I wasn't getting from the law firm. Now, I was also getting, a third less salary, so my personal line budget went, dramatically down. But I got so much more out of the work that I was doing. That I just really loved it. And then when I, got the offered the challenge of being the Inspector General of the Intelligence Community, I felt like I'd come sort of, full circle in terms of going into government service because of 9/11. And now here we come, actually can, hopefully make a significant contribution to national security. And I loved being an Inspector General. I really loved the mission, protecting national security. I really loved the people. And I have nothing but good to say about public service.
So in light of those comments and your departure as Inspector General, how are you thinking about your future after becoming such a public figure?
Well, I'm still trying to figure out what the next step is. I've enjoyed, I was fortunate to be able to have the last several months, surrounded by family and friends. So that was really good. I'm not sure what's next. A lot of it depends on what happens with the election and what I, want to do next, whether it's go back to a law firm or see what happens with the election and shakes out. I really enjoyed being a lawyer, a private practice lawyer as well. There's a lot of good you can do as a private attorney, not only with the zealous advocacy you give for your clients, but also the pro bono opportunities that you can provide, and give back to your community, and also, pay forward in terms of mentoring the next generation of lawyers. So I think that, I'm very fortunate to, for the education I got, the experiences I've had. I feel like I just have to, figure out for myself what's next.
Let me ask you just one last question, Michael. I mean, as you said, you've been fortunate to have such a strong education and a great set of experiences. We have a lot of young people on today's call. What advice do you have for young people who are enthusiastic about giving back and want to ensure the health of our democratic institutions, especially at the very time that so many of our democratic institutions, their legitimacy is being called into question? How would you advise those young people?
I would advise them to jump right in. Honestly, I just, there's always a part of us that want to hold back and are reluctant to take significant career steps. When I was in private practice, I'd been there for 11 years. I was a partner. I had all the support staff. I had associates working for me. I was very comfortable. I was making a lot of money, but I knew I wanted to do something else, and I went into the government in a line trial attorney position. So no secretary, no associates, no travel agent, like that I'm doing it all. Not all, because there's other folks in the same, going through the same thing, but I loved it. It's, you just don't want to you want to challenge yourself. You don't want to feel like if you don't try, you won't succeed because you're just not even giving yourself a chance. And I also remember when I, was interviewing to join the Department of Justice, and I was in private practice, and I go to the interview, and I'm older than most of the folks that they're trying to recruit for these line positions. But the government office was, by the White House. And I remember, I had a couple minutes section. I walked around the corner from the government office, and there was the Washington Monument. And I thought, what? There are some pretty good people who've worked for the government. I think I could do that. I think that even if I don't, no matter what the career is, there's good that can come of this. And so I walked into the interview and got the job. So I say jump right in.
Great. Michael, thank you so much. Professor Grant Rear, who's also the director of the Campbell Public Affairs Institute and an expert in American politics, has been fielding our questions. So again, I just want to remind our audience, first of all, thank you for so many of you being here with us today. And there, right at the bottom of your screen, there is a Q&A area. And I'm going to let Grant begin to facilitate some of the questions that are coming in. And Michael, I'm going to let you respond to those.
Great, thanks, Dave. And we're getting some really fantastic questions here. I want to just apologize in advance to the folks whose questions I'm not going to be able to get to. There is a rough temporal logic to a lot of them, so I'm going to insert that here. Let me start off with a question about the current situation, what is, and focus on Congress, and then we'll get into what might be. But Kathy Daykoff wanted to know what Mr. Atkinson's sense is of the current level of effectiveness of congressional oversight committees and their ability to get the information that they need in order to exercise that oversight.
So that's a really good question. And I can only speak to the time period when I was there. And I do think quite a bit has changed in the last 6 months. But I will say that, my experience was through April of, 2020, that and I can really only speak to the Congressional Intelligence Committees. That's who I did most of my work with. That both on the House side and on the Senate side, they were very engaged. And I thought that both DNI Coates and the acting director of national intelligence, Joe McGuire, were very, were as open as I think as the law would permit them to be, and I think that they had pretty good. I know that DNI Coates had, really good, healthy relationships from what I could see and what I could hear with the Congressional Intelligence Committees, and I think that the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence in particular has done a very good job, in my opinion, of acting in a bipartisan way to review the information that they get from the intelligence community and release their findings in a really professional way, and in many ways in a non-political way. So while I was there, I was very impressed with the rigor of the oversight and the responsiveness of the ODNI and certainly my office to the intelligence committees.
So here's a question in a similar vein, and I think it's a lawyer's question. It's from David Dreesen, and he wanted to get your take on, can Congress provide for cause removal protection under SEALA law for IGs, and should it? Maybe you'll need to unpack the question for the non-experts in the audience.
Yeah, well, I'm not going to pretend to be an expert either on some of these executive branch authorities. We were talking about this earlier, and I do think that if there's not going to be a clear understanding between the president and the Congress about the circumstances under which an inspector general can be removed, that is, if there's not some clear understanding that it has to be for some type of cause, then the law, it seems to me, does have to be, there will have to be adjustments made to the law if Congress does in fact reasonably expect inspectors general to act as independent and objective oversight authorities. And I do think, one thing that they'll have to look at is term limits. That IGs traditionally have been able to serve between administrations, and for as long as they are doing the job ably and effectively. I think that, and there's benefits to that, because I will tell you that term limit, it seems to have there's some legal constitutional benefit for that. But I'll also say that, if you want to establish an effective and efficient office, it has to be relatively long term, because it just takes a while, from my experience, to establish the right culture in your office, and to establish a trust between the workforce and the oversight authorities. And so the more that overturns, however frequent that overturns, you just restart that process, and it's just a challenge. I mean, I took over an office that was really, going through some very public problems. It hadn't had a confirmed IG for a couple of years, and it was publicly just being ridiculed for its whistleblower protection, especially. And so, my first order of business was to go in there and try to, right the ship. And what's especially hard about that as an IG in the intelligence community is my biggest management challenge by far, was bringing people into my office and getting them through the security clearance process in a reasonable amount of time. So, we had people, waiting months and months and months to get into the office. And that is a significant challenge when you're trying to change an office culture. There are plenty of good people in the office, don't get me wrong, but the responsibilities were immense, and it was really hard to bring new people in. So you have to do whatever you clearly have to. I'm a rule of law person, so we have to do whatever what the law requires. But just understand that the more you make an office like an inspector general different from other offices, there's just consequences to that in terms of their ability to manage that office effectively.
And then Rich Wilhelm wanted to get your take on, do you think that in your case here, the system broke down because of the extraordinary current political situation that we're in, and therefore the system is the system okay if we're living in a historical norm?
So I'm not sure exactly in terms of the system, what system that question is getting to, but I'll take in the context of both the independence of IGs and of the whistleblower protections. And in terms of the independent IGs, I think what I've tried to get across to is that system needs to be, we need to relook at that system in terms of independence. At the same time, you can be removed for being independent. That's not where I think Congress ever planned or intended to land, but that's the reality of today, in my opinion. And then in terms of the whistleblower system, I think that the system was at risk of breaking down in terms of getting that complaint to the intelligence committees. I think there was a real risk that the system could break down, where there was a period of time when you had a whistleblower in the intelligence community who wanted to make a complaint to the intelligence committees that involved classified information, and that whistleblower was that expectation and the law that seemed to require that was being frustrated. And so I do think there was a period of time when there was a real question about whether the system was working the way it should. Ultimately the complaint did go forward, and Congress heard about the complaint and in an authorized way. By the way, the whistleblower followed the rules as far as I could tell every step of the way, and the intelligence committees were able to do the oversight that the Constitution, separation of powers, requires of them.
Well, that kind of leads to a concern that I think Rich's question leads to this concern that Dylan Garvin brought up, which is the worry that your removal has set a really dangerous precedent now going forward, and that future presidents will feel more empowered to simply replace IGs that they think are going to cause them problems with loyalists. So do you worry about that? Has that precedent been set?
So I'm biased because I'm the one that got fired, but I do think that precedent has been set, and I think that the reaction by prominent members on the Hill who had been, vocal and longstanding supporters of inspectors general, not really, in my opinion, doing what they said they were going to do in terms of protecting IGs and making sure that the independence was something that was viewed favorably as opposed to used as an excuse for a firing. And that's why I say, in terms of the understanding, if the understanding is that an IG can be removed for doing his or her job, that's not a good place. That's a bad precedent. And that's why I say there has to be an understanding that there has to be something more, that the Inspector General did something more than just do his or her job. There's some cause that would lead to the removal. It's just not tenable to have the situation we have today, and it just expects a lot of a public servant to put their career and their livelihood on the line when it's just foreseeable. It's reasonably foreseeable that what will happen, and because it's happened. And I'm not the only one. Steve Linick, who was the Inspector General of the State Department, was removed. And I know the State Department has come up with some reasons for his removal, but I work closely with Steve, and I think that he was a model Inspector General, and so that's a very bad precedent as well, in my opinion. And then to have a guy like Glenn Fine, who had been the acting Inspector General at the Department of Defense, to have him removed from his position on one of the pandemic committees, oversight committees, that's a for no reason. Other than I could tell that he would do a very competent and independent job. Now maybe there were other reasons. I know Glenn quite well, and I just can't think of a better person, for that job. And now Steve Linick, Glenn Fine, two dedicated, long-time public servants are out of public service, and so that's just not in the best interest of the United States.
Well, and then that leads directly to a couple other questions, and one of them comes from someone that wanted to remain anonymous, but it really is very similar to another question from Greg Milanovich. They're both basically asking, okay, now that you've said what you've just said, what then do you say to public servants and who are worried about their careers, but also want to be transparent and open and honest and candid? They have to worry about their livelihoods. And so what do you say to folks at sort of that middle level moving up when they can see, it's getting more dangerous the higher up they go?
Well, first of all, let me just say that I encourage anonymous complaints. So there's no wrong with anybody remaining anonymous. We encourage all of those complaints. I think it's well, here's what I'll say is that I do think that there are plenty of inspectors general in office today who are upholding their obligation to act independently and objectively. I'm convinced that's happening. And I also am convinced that there are plenty of public servants who are, in fact, the vast majority of public servants who are, following their ethical duty to report wrongdoing in the government when they see it. Now, that's not to say that there's not risks to being a public servant, because there are. And what you want to make sure is that they're not unreasonable risks, and that the folks, are working, with a net, if you will. And so there are other protections available to ordinary civil service employees that, I was a political appointee. So that's different from a civil service employee or an intelligence community employee who have other, administrative rights that I, as a political appointee, didn't have. And I'm convinced that those protections, whether it's, particularly when it comes to the Office of Special Counsel, who has responsibility for investigating those types of retaliatory complaints, I'm convinced that office and many more like them are still operating effectively. it's different when it's a political appointee like me. And look, I understood the type of administration I was joining when I took office in May of 2018. I understood by that point how President Trump's view of some of his views on the intelligence community and some of his views on political appointees. So I took some known professional risks. I thought I had some additional protection because of the expectation to be independent and objective, but at the same time, I knew there were professional risks, and I certainly knew the professional risks that came with the way I ended the decision I made on the Ukraine whistleblower complaint. I clearly understood that I was almost certainly going to be removed at some point.
Well, you got into this a little bit earlier when you were talking about some of the possible recommendations you might make. Term limits, I think, is one of the things that you were discussing earlier. And Barb Seckler and Kenneth Auerbach asked a similar set of questions that want to kind of push you further on that, and to imagine that you were giving advice to Congress about changing laws to strengthen the IG system and more generally the system of monitoring and watching the watchers. And Barb's specific spin on her question was, imagine a Biden-Harris victory in November. What kinds of things do you think that administration should be taking? What steps should they be taking to restore confidence and the integrity in the process?
Well, I do think it's important to. I think there's two things. There are things that you can say, and there are things that you can do, and hopefully they align. Because if they don't align, then there's a lack of integrity there. But it's important to say the right things to public servants and to inspectors general. And the thing to say is to public servants, particularly whistleblowers, is we want you to speak up. We encourage you to speak up. And when you do speak up, we'll protect you. That you have to, that's important to say. And then when they do speak up, you need to act in ways that in fact protect them and don't politicize, or even worse, try to do something like expose their identities that can cause, real harm. Like you have to do what you say you're going to do. And if you want whistleblowers to speak up and you say you're going to protect them, then you need to do it, whether it's an ordinary whistleblower or an extraordinary whistleblower. And the same for inspectors general. If you want independent inspectors general, then you should say that. And I hope whoever's in office wants that, because there's real value in that. And it's important to national security, and independent inspectors general are in the best interest of the United States. So it's important to say that, but it's even more important to do what you say you're going to do, which is when you see an independent inspector general who acts independently and objectively and consistent with the law, it's important to act in ways that validate that behavior, and not act in ways that undermine it, contradict it, or would lead others in similar positions to believe that they couldn't do what the law seems to require them to do. And I'm not being very helpful in terms of the specific recommendations for legislation. I do have thoughts on that, but I'm just not sure this is the right forum for those, because my thoughts are not fully formed, and I've given great consideration to it. I apologize if I'm not being as responsive as folks would like on this issue, because it is an important issue about how to thread the needle between the executive branch, the president's executive branch authorities, and independent inspectors general. I've offered some ideas. I'm sorry if I'm not being more responsive on others. It's just a really complicated area, and it's a very complicated area of the law as well, particularly for it gets really complicated.
So one thing that has been of great concern, I think, to a lot of folks that study government is the trend over recent decades of a real plummeting of public trust in the government and pretty much all of the institutions in government. And this is something that predates the Trump administration. It's a long-term trend, but we are at now really all-time lows. And so Peter Brennan wanted to know, do you think that the current administration has really damaged significantly the public's perception of and confidence in the U.S. intelligence community?
I think I'm going to answer it this way. I think that the corollary to the decrease in public trust over the years is in government is matched by the increasing number of Americans who support whistleblowers. There was a poll, a survey that came out this week that showed that over 80% of Americans, over 80%, close to 90% of both Democrats, Republicans, independents support whistleblowers. And I think that's a reflection of some of the mistrust in government and a reflection that these are people, whistleblowers, who can help identify, problems in government. And I was surprised to see the numbers that high, given what happened with the Ukraine whistleblower situation. But that's what the survey says. And I do wonder, whether it's sort of generic whistleblowers or whether it's, if you ask them a specific whistleblower, how that percentage might change. But I do think, generally, the American people support whistleblowers by large margins. Because of their, they want a clean government. At least, the same 80 or 90% who are in favor of whistleblowers clearly are in favor of, seems to me, clean government, because that's one of the primary purposes of whistleblowers. And so I do think there's been a steady erosion of public trust in government. But at the same time, I do think, I don't know that you've seen the same erosion in the public servants in government. And I think, in fact, the survey this week suggests that the American people are still, trusting and in need of, people in government who will speak up and do the right thing.
So I'll give you a lighter question now. You can take a short break from these deep policy and philosophy questions. David Bruin wanted to know, tell us about sort of the insider story of the confirmation process. What was that like? Who helps you? How did you prepare? How intimidating was it?
So I started the confirmation process. I was nominated in the middle of November of 2017. And then I had my confirmation hearing about 2 months later, on January 17th of 2018. And what happens is, like I talked about, going around and doing the individual meet and greets with many of the senators on the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, because that's where my nomination was going to pass through. That's where my confirmation hearing was going to be in front of. And so I would go meet with them one-on-one, many of them. And I had an employee from what was going to be my office, the Inspector General of Intelligence Community, who would go around with me, who was the legislative counsel for the Inspector General's office, who had relationships with many of the senators and more specifically the staff members. And so that lawyer and I would go up to the Hill and do these 30 minutes to 60-minute meetings with individual senators in their offices, usually with one or two of their staff members, and answer their questions. And I would give them some of my background. And I'm telling you, every single time I would also get questions about, can you be independent? Can you be apolitical? Will you protect whistleblowers? Whether it was a Republican, Democratic, or independent. And Angus King, who's senator from Maine, is an independent. So all across the board, those are the questions. So how do you prepare for it? There's a lot of, I had been in the intelligence community, I had been at the Department of Justice's National Security Division, so for the previous 2 years, so I was pretty reasonably comfortable with what the intelligence community did. I I did read quite added to my reading list in terms of books on the intelligence community to get up to speed on areas that I wasn't as familiar with. So there was self-education as well. There was those individual meetings. And then the Senate confirmation hearing, that was quite stressful. I'll be honest. It was, I had never testified on live television, and you're surrounded by family and friends, and you're on live television, and you kind of have a sense of what the senators are going to ask you, at least those that you met with, because they what's on their mind. And then some senator staff members, a handful would give hints, specific hints about what their senator was likely to ask. But then there are other senators who, I didn't meet with, and I had no idea what the questions were going to be. And so that was the stressful part, was getting a question and not, knowing the question in advance. Maybe it took me back to my days at Syracuse when I would go into class and be totally unprepared. So I was okay with that. It's comfortable. But the other, and it is stressful. It's unnerving. And I remember, I'll give you a quick story here. During the confirmation hearing, I'm sitting at the table. The senators are up on the dais. My family's sitting behind me. And it's at the time it was Richard Burr from North Carolina, who's the chair, and Mark Warner, who's the vice chair, senator from Virginia. And I'm giving my opening statement. Cameras are rolling. Photographers are clicking pictures. And I see that Chairman Burr and Vice Chairman Warner are talking to each other and pointing at my feet. And I have no idea why they're pointing at my feet. And then I see to my right, one of the photographers get on his stomach and start taking pictures of my feet. And I have no idea what's happening. I start to imagine that somehow my pants have caught fire. My pant legs have caught fire. And so I'm going to burn myself up on live television. And all I can think is, oh my God, this is C-SPAN 3. Why couldn't it at least be C-SPAN 1 or 2? It turned out after the hearing, the senators come down from the dais, Senator Burr and Senator Warner, and they walk right past me, and they're going to come meet our families, meet the families. And so they walk right up to my sons who are sitting behind me. And Senator Burr says, which one of you two is rocking those socks? And so my youngest son pulls up his pant legs, and he's got these red, white, and blue socks and a picture of the U.S. Capitol on the front of each. And I finally realized what was attracting all of their attention. But it was quite nerve-wracking. And then I'll also say, you never know where you are in the confirmation process. Sissy voted me out unanimously. I also had to go through another Senate committee, at least for a committee vote. I passed through that unanimously. And so I thought I was, on the road for confirmation, and then I got held up. And it only takes one senator to hold your vote up. And so, and then you don't know where you are. It's a real murky world in terms of where you are in the process or what you can do to get unstuck. And finally, in May 17th, 2018, the lone senator who had put a hold on me lifted the hold, and within hours, I had been voted out by unanimous consent and had gotten confirmed.
So we're going to go back to the heavy questions now. And
okay.
And then I'll pose this question, and then I saw the dean jotting down some notes, so he may have some follow-ups that he wants to ask based on what he's heard. But this question comes from Eric Rogers, and I just need to say that he has been a real stalwart in the State of Democracy series. He and his spouse have been to every single one of them as long as I've been director, except for one that they had to miss. I think it was for an anniversary trip overseas. So he's got a big picture question for you, and it's simply this. Aren't there times when moral authority has to supersede the law when it comes to whistleblowers? Are there moments when the moral question is just simply more important?
That's so I'm a rule of law guy, being a lawyer by training, and I am convinced that you, I believe that you have to, act within the rule of law. If there are circumstances where that's not possible, that's a different world. But I do believe that within the rule of law, there are ways to act. There are ways that you can use the rule of law, to get where you need to go. It may not be, you may not get there immediately. It may take some time, and hopefully it's not a matter where you don't have time to work through the problem. But I felt like with the whistleblower situation that there were ways within that the law. The Congress had done a pretty good job, and all the laws that I'm talking about were also passed by the president, past presidents, that of contemplating, difficult situations. And so the laws were there contemplating that there might be a situation where I had an issue as an inspector general that I was just in complete disagreement with either the president or my direct boss, the director of national intelligence. And the law provided mechanisms for me to raise that concern to Congress myself. And ultimately, that's the law that I used to get the whistleblowers' concern to Congress. I used the law, even though it wasn't, it wasn't necessarily contemplated that it would be used in a whistleblower situation, but the law said that if I had an unresolved difference with the director of national intelligence that affected one of my duties, then I had an obligation to immediately inform Congress of that fact. So that's what the law, there was that law on the books, and that's the law that I used once I realized that the whistleblowers' efforts to get to the committee were being frustrated, that there was another law out there that allowed me to get to where I needed to go. I do think that in terms of being an inspector general, I do think there's huge value in having legal training, being trained as a lawyer, because the laws are complicated, and you can have in-house lawyers, but ultimately it was my decision, and so I just felt that my training as a lawyer, staying within the rule of law, and not having to go outside the law or take the law into my own hands. Because you also have to remember, in terms of doing what you say you're going to do, as the Inspector General of the intelligence community, I told people every day, you have to operate within the law. You have to make authorized disclosures. You can't leak. It's illegal. And so for me, having said all of that, to then do something different where I decide for myself that the law is not sufficient and that I need to make my own moral decision and make my own, create my own law to get where I think I need to go. I just, I wasn't going to do that. I'm not saying that there wouldn't be circumstances necessarily where it might be appropriate, but I just think in our system, with our system of checks and balances, with people acting in good faith, and that's a big thing, they have to act in good faith. There are ways to operate within the law without, going outside of it.
And Dave, did you want to jump in and ask a question or follow up with any of that?
No, I'll let you keep going, Grant. It was just
Okay.
interesting to see a number of student questions
Yes.
where they'd like to hear a little bit more from Michael. Several
Sure.
of them were my former students, so I was.
Oh, okay. Well, I hope I'm going to pick one of them here. And yeah, there are over 20 questions still here, Michael. We won't be able to get to them all, but there's one here from Kevin Treadway, and then I want to ask a question from Sarah Jones that's very career oriented. But the one from Kevin kind of attaches to what you've been talking about here. So he wanted to know, it is quite often that whistleblowers go through non-official routes. They leak information, and that's the method that they use to do that. Do you think there are some common reasons as to why that's the case, and maybe why we've seen so much of it more recently?
So I don't have data to answer that question. I can't point to a study or evidence to say why that happens or what, how often there's a commonality. I'll tell you from my experience that people tend to go outside the channel if they don't trust the channel. Or they think that, and they don't trust the channel because either they feel like their message won't be heard, or it'll be distorted, or they'll be threatened with some sort of harm, professional demotion, loss of security clearance, if they go through the authorized channel. And so I don't, that's what I saw in terms of why. Now, there's also, there's a lot of information that gets leaked in Washington that isn't national security information, and it's just sort of, that there's a sort of an industry of leaks within Washington but when it comes to national security information, those leaks that tend to do harm, the reasons that I've heard given tend to do with trust in the system. And so that's why it's just critical for inspectors general or for Congress and for politicians especially, to do what you say you're going to do. If you say you're going to protect whistleblowers, then you need to protect whistleblowers in ordinary and extraordinary matters. You can't pick and choose the whistleblowers you're going to, protect and not protect, because that leads people to mistrust the system. And if they're not going to, these people are intrinsically, many of them are intrinsically motivated. And I don't have evidence for this, but in my experience, they all think they're doing the right thing. And so they're not going to, if they think they're doing the right thing, but they can't get their message to who they think needs to hear it, and they don't trust the way the process is being run, they will deliver that message. It just won't be in a lawful way. And so again, it's very important that people trust the system, and the way people trust the system is for the system to have integrity. Integrity, meaning it's not just honest people running the system, it's people who will do what they said they were going to do.
And then Sarah Jones wanted to get your advice on managing social media profiles. That does seem like it's so easy to make a misstep there, or to have something that might affect a security clearance for a young person just getting started, or perhaps later on even result in some kind of scandal. So do you have advice about thinking about social media profiles? Maybe you could share, yours, how you've done this.
I have no social media profile, and that's purposeful. I was a prosecutor for 18 years. Prosecutors are also not supposed to be political. Supposed to follow the facts, follow the law, and let the chips fall where they may. And so it was very important to me that not only that I act non-politically, but that I also not have the appearance of any sort of political leanings. And so I purposefully did not establish any social media profile. I don't have a Facebook page. I don't have any I'm not on Twitter. And I do think there's ways to engage in social media in responsible ways, but I think what's embedded in that question is the common sense that is required for that. Is you do have to be mindful that what goes on social media will stay on social media, and you do have to be mindful that if you're interested in a career in the intelligence community, you will have to go through a security background check. I've been through several. I had to go through another one as a political appointee, and all of that social media, I shouldn't say all, but you have to be mindful that, the people who want to know whether can be a trusted source for the United States government will look at the information that you've put out there on yourself. And so just be mindful of that. And also I would say the same thing, if you're with your your texts and your emails. I would also say it with respect to the apps that you're downloading. I think there's a real reason why some of these apps, the United States government is very concerned about the national security implications that come with some of these apps that are publicly available. And so I would, I'd be, just be a good public citizen. You don't have to believe, you shouldn't believe everything you read in the newspapers. Trust me. But, be mindful of what the national security professionals are telling you publicly about some of the dangers potentially of some of these apps. I would take it all into account.
So I want to try to squeeze two questions in before we end. One from Rachel Cunningham, which I think is a really good one to end on. But before I get to hers, Bob Marat has a very specific question for you. He wants to get your take on the current status of Tom Monheim and then the nomination of Alan Souza to your former assignment.
So I don't have any personal information on either of those questions. I've been out of office since May. I wasn't allowed back into the building after April. So I just don't have any personal knowledge on that. I have the same information that's available publicly.
Okay. And then this is, I think, a good way to end. Rachel Cunningham would like to hear you talk a little bit more about what still inspires you for public service. Where do you get that passion for serving the public from, given what you've been through?
I think the passion comes from doing what I love to do, and that comes from just taking on new challenges. So when I was the Inspector General of the Intelligence Community, I dealt from everything from employees who weren't coming to work to how are we going to, as an intelligence community oversight group, going to deal with artificial intelligence and machine learning. And so I'm a political science, major, not a math major. And so but I had to become knowledgeable about artificial intelligence and machine learning and all of the consequences that come from that. For the first couple of months when I was on the job as the Inspector General of the Intelligence Community, I felt like I had joined the Air Force, or what's now the Space Force, because I went around the country and around the world going to satellite ground stations, which is where the satellites send the intelligence down to the ground, and then the ground analyzes that and disseminates it to the intelligence community and to policymakers. That was all new to me. And it was, much of it was new to me. And it was just fascinating. And so part of the passion comes from just wanting to learn about new things. And public service offers that. There's a lot of options in public service, whether as a lawyer, as a public policy major, as an accountant. There's just a lot of different options and a lot of different areas of knowledge. And so I have a passion for learning new things, and public service offers that. And then most importantly, public service offers you an opportunity to give back and to give back to the public. And it's something much bigger than yourself. And it's just, I just never found anything as rewarding as public service. That's not to say I won't, but I didn't. And honestly, I'm not sure I ever will.
That's a great message for our students. Dave, I'll turn it back over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Grant. Michael, thank you very much for generously sharing your time and expertise with us today. This was terrific. And it's great to have you as an alum. Thank you so much for being willing to do this. But thank you so much for your service. And as one of the comments noted, thank you for the moral courage that it took to make the right decision at a time where increasingly the kinds of decisions are very complicated. And you gave us some insight into an environment that was filled with complexity. And yet for you, there was a real clarity about what had to be done. And we just really appreciate all that you have done. We thank you for your past and hopefully future service as well. And I want to thank everyone who joined us today. It was great to see such a large group here. And to conclude, I just want to say, please stay healthy and safe, and please vote. And join us again for another Maxwell event. I hope you all have a great evening, and we really appreciate your participation. Good night, everyone.